My topic for today is Ukraine and its Jews. When Rabbi Morris and I were first talking about the various topics and how we would actually phrase this, we had some challenge because, the situation on the ground is changing so dramatically that we needed to choose a fairly generic topic that would cover all possibilities. So what I'm planning to do is to develop a single thesis, which I hope to demonstrate with a concrete graphic piece of art immediately, and then work through a historical narrative, and then bring it to the present day. And at that point, we'll wrap it up and we'll open it up for discussion and questions to see if my thesis works at all. Can you all see my screen? Ms. Slava, would you please nod your head if you see the image on the background there? Okay, great. Okay, so that's the plan. Now, the thesis is basically that historically, Jews of Ukraine have oriented themselves culturally like they have in most countries as a minority. They have oriented themselves towards the most powerful national unit in multinational states. So, for example, in Austria-Hungary, they tended to be more Austrophile. When Hungary became much more independent after 1867, you begin to develop a Hungarian-Jewish identity. In Ukraine, they were first Polonophile, meaning like developing an identity that began to connect them to the ruling Poles and then later to the ruling Russians. But in the last 3 decades since independence from the Soviet Union, I would like to tender for our discussion that the Ukrainian Jews have begun to develop, really for the first time in their history, a Ukrainian Jewish identity, which has very significant implications for the current moment we're in and for the future. As a kind of point of departure, have a look at this unusual Holocaust memorial, which is located on the wall of the Great Synagogue of Lutsk. Let me just show you where that is located in Ukraine itself. Here's a map that shows, I've dropped a little pin where Lutsk is. It is in northwestern Ukraine, just to give you some orientation. Here's Kyiv, and then to the right is Poltava, which I know is a place very important to you because it's a sister city to your organization, to your temple, and also Odessa here in the south. So this is in the western part of Ukraine, not too far from Lviv, or Lviv as it's pronounced now. This is the actual site of the monument on the side of the 17th century Lutsk Great Synagogue, which was built in the classic fortress style, possibly because of the many Cossack rebellions that we're going to discuss in a moment that occurred in that place. But let's have a closer look at the image itself. First of all, a couple of superficial things. The first is you can see between 2010, when the photograph on the right was taken, and 2011, just a year later, when this photograph was taken, there's been some, decay to the building, and no one has maintained it. I don't know what it looks like today. I don't have any friends in Lutsk to take a more contemporary picture, but that says something about how it exists within the public sphere. Secondly, it seems like there's been some minor vandalism. Some people may have put some stickers on here, which could have been for anything. Could be a political thing, a commercial thing, who knows? And it's been hastily removed, which means something, but not completely removed. So that's just superficial observations, which may be relevant later. But then if you look at the text, in the triangles below, you can see that here there is a text that describes the history of the Jews of Lutsk right up unto the Holocaust, but the language that's used there is Ukrainian, not Russian, which is rather unusual. Particularly during the Soviet years, Ukrainian would certainly have been the third language, certainly not the first language, but Ukrainian is there prominently, and there is no Russian text at all. Jews overwhelmingly spoke Russian first for the 20th century, not Ukrainian. Nevertheless, this Jewish memorial on a synagogue is written in Ukrainian. Secondly, on the left-hand side, you see it's written in Hebrew, not Yiddish. Yiddish, of course, was the overwhelming vernacular of the Jews in the 19th century and prior to that. the fact that they would choose Hebrew indicates that it's very strongly oriented towards Israel, the modern state of Israel. So here you have a monument on the side of a synagogue that is texted in Ukrainian and in Hebrew, but the most dramatic and striking element of this image, which I'm sure many of you have picked up on, but it would have been instinctive to anyone in Ukraine, is the shape. You can see that the figure in the center, which looks like a Jew with hands raised in prayer looking upward, is clearly evocative of the trident of Volodymyr. This is the national symbol of Ukraine, which is named after Saint Volodymyr, the first figure in Ukrainian history to convert to Christianity in the year 988. It is a distinctly Christian and Ukrainian nationalist symbol, and here it is embedded directly into the very structure of this monument. So I'm using this as kind of like a thought piece in art to look at how Jews in Ukraine may be envisioning themselves in an independent Ukraine, which represents a break from much of their prior history. Speaking of the history, let's go to that now. So here is a very well-known map, the Pale of Settlement. This is the region in the former Russian Empire prior to 1917 where Jews were allowed to live in Russia. Russia proper had banned all Jews from the year 1479 when, in somewhat of a scandalous development, a member of the royal household, influenced by a local Jewish doctor, converted to Judaism. And at that point, the church was enraged, and they actually embarked on a centuries-long campaign to root out what they called as Judaizers, and no Jew was allowed, except under very exceptional circumstances, to live in Russia proper. Catherine the Great, the 18th century ruler who was involved with the dismemberment of Poland, suddenly found herself, with the acquisition of those Polish territories, the owner of the largest single population of Jews in the world. And although the church urged her to expel them or do something with them, she nevertheless effected a compromise by creating this territory where Jews were allowed to live. And as you can see, it extends in the north from the Lithuanian and southern Latvian territories down through what would later be Belarus. On the western part, it has the Kingdom of Poland, and then the large part towards the south is Ukraine. This circle here just roughly describes the main area of Jewish settlement, which was on the right bank of the Dnieper River, which bisects Ukraine. It goes through Kyiv and then down to the Black Sea, and most Jews lived on the western side of that river. Poltava was towards the newer area of Jewish settlement, and Odessa as well for other reasons, because it was founded in a late time. Now, for the most part in this region, Jews lived among Ukrainians in a kind of an economic symbiosis where there were moments of conflict that I'm going to explain in a moment. But by and large, it was uneventful. By and large, they slowly picked up cultural habits and tics and ideas from each other. Most of Eastern European Jewish cooking, for example, is overwhelmingly Ukrainian in nature. There's a tremendous amount of Ukrainian in the Yiddish language. A certain amount of Yiddish also made it into Ukrainian and so on. But if Jews had to sort of identify with a nationality after being Jewish, it tended to be Russian, because the Russians were the dominant power, and it's dangerous for minorities to identify with a powerless population. Even though they may be the dominant population in a region, nevertheless, it might not work out well for them, as we shall describe. There was one moment, however, where this changed dramatically, and that is the topic of the dissertation that Rabbi Morrison mentioned earlier. During the brief period of the immediately after the collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917, Ukrainians and Jews attempted to establish an independent state, which was founded on much more European principles, not as an ethnic nation state, but rather as a citizen-based state in which all minorities would have unprecedented rights and privileges, including the Jews. And as one artifact of that period, here is a 100 karbovanets bill, a unit of currency from that very brief-lived time. And on the other side of this bill, it's all in Ukrainian, which was the dominant language, at least in terms of the population. But on this side, the obverse, you had 100 karbovanets written in Russian, Polish, and right below the numbers 100, you see it's written in Yiddish, because the Jews were actually given a minister of Jewish affairs. They were allocated tax dollars for Jewish schools and mikvaot and synagogues and things like that. It was a really wonderful kind of utopian idea that ended in horrific failure, largely because of the pogrom violence that swept over the countryside in the civil war of that era. And most painfully, about 40% of the pogroms that were recorded were actually perpetrated by forces that were ostensibly loyal to the same government that printed this bill, which is an irony that I pursued in my research. So what happened in Ukraine is now we get to a new period, 100 years later, where there's an opportunity to kind of resurrect that unique moment of cooperation. But Ukraine has a lot of identity formation that itself has to explain. Like, for example, you can see here, Ukraine does recognize its unique Jewish population and its long Jewish history that, as we shall see, goes back 1,000 years. And they're prepared in a kind of much more European mode to celebrate and commemorate that. This is a stamp dated 2011 that commemorates the 70th anniversary of the tragedy of Babi Yar. That's the horrific massacre of some 30,000 Jews in the space of just a handful of days when the Germans entered Kiev in the Second World War. But at the same time, here in 2009, they have another stamp that's dated 2009 that commemorates the 100th anniversary of the birth of Stepan Bandera, who is one of the figures who was most in favor of collaborating with the Nazis when they invaded Ukraine. So how is it possible that a country can at the same time celebrate its Jewish minority and promote its Jewish minority, acknowledge its long presence there, have a Jewish president, and at the same time, it makes sense within their culture to commemorate a Nazi collaborator? This is one of the great paradoxes that I hope we'll have an opportunity to explain. So let's just do a very quick historical review. How did the Jews get to Ukraine? The Jews actually have an incredibly long history there. There are, some kind of hazy, legendary statements about Jews living in Ukraine, especially on the Black Sea coast from the first centuries of the Common Era. There's also a population in Ukraine associated with Khazaria in the 10th century, so really quite old, really at the very beginnings of Ukrainian culture. But the big masses of Jewish migration to Ukraine happened in the 12th through the 17th centuries, primarily from the Rhineland, the traditional heartland known as Ashkenaz. The reason for this are twofold. First, there was increasingly unwelcome anti-Semitic pressures that were forcing the Jews from the West to consider new homes. The rise of the blood libel in the 12th century, the host desecration in the 13th century, the Black Death in the 14th century, repeated expulsions of Jews from France 3 times in the 14th century alone, made Jews consider that they were not necessarily welcome in Western Europe. And at the same time, there was a second factor. There was a vacuum for precisely the kind of skills that Jews had in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe was beginning to develop its economy, and they needed an urban population that was literate and especially numerate, that could actually work with numbers and figures and basic accounting, that could understand commerce, that understood metallurgy. A lot of the earliest mitteners of this period were actually Jews, and some of the earliest Polish coins are actually written in Hebrew characters, for example. And so Jews were actually invited to settle in in the regions that were controlled by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, in particular their southern land holdings in Ukraine. So that's basically when Jews started making their way from Ashkenaz to Ukraine. The economic structure of the region was very much kind of like caste-like, where the vast majority of Ukrainians were agrarian, working the fields, and the landowners, the higher classes, tended to be Poles, quite often living far away in Poland itself. And here's where the Jews came in. The Poles would basically hire the Jews to act as middlemen or leaseholders through a system called the arenda, which is a kind of tax farming, where the Polish nobleman would say, I would like you Jews to manage my large farm called the latifundia, which include more than farms. It included the entire villages. It included the mills, the presses, and literally even the people, because the Ukrainians were serfs, which is not exactly the same thing as a slave, but not quite as high as a peasant. They were, attached to the land. They could not leave the land. They could not marry without the permission of the Lord, and so on. And the nobleman would typically, the Polish nobleman would typically say to the Jew, okay, you and your community, I want you to raise 1,000 zloty from my latifundia, and the Jews would go out and do it. And they were empowered by the nobleman with, the force of law to impose any kind of taxes that would successfully raise that amount of money. The Jews would, of course, raise more than that. They would raise, let's say, 1,200 zloty, because the other 200 would be their profit, and then they would turn over the 1,000 zloty to the Polish nobleman. The problem was that the system was inherently exploitative, such that if the Jews did a good job and they turned up on time with the 1,000 zloty in hand, then the nobleman might be tempted to say, hey, you know what? That seemed pretty easy. I guess I underbid. I would like you to collect 1,100 zloty next year. And that meant the Jews had to come back and get more creative and more oppressive in finding different ways to tax the local Ukrainian population. And there were many innovative ways of taxation which were, increasingly hated by the local population. One of them, for example, was propinatia, which was essentially the monopoly on the distillation and sale of alcohol, which meant that Jews in Ukraine basically cornered the market on all of the inns or krechmas. That's what this art from the 1920s represents, a traditional Jewish krechma, which has Jews involved in the sale of alcohol and also very much involved in music, klezmer, and so on. And Ukrainians, in their best finery, come to enjoy a little bit of socialization. But if you can imagine that, the Jew is, collecting taxes on this, and maybe he'll allow people to run up a tab, and then at harvest season, you've got to pay up a large amount, perhaps with interest. And the most hated of the accusations, which was widely circulated in Ukrainian folk songs, is the accusation that Jews actually held the keys to churches, and that if you wanted to baptize your child or get your children married, you had to pay the Jew to open up the church, which was heavily resented. What ended up happening, as you can imagine, is there was a rebellion in the 17th century led by Bogdan Khmelnytsky, and he was able to capitalize on the large number of people called Cossacks or Kozake, who were essentially runaway serfs who had made their way to the borderlands, to the region of Zaporizhia, which is today where they have the nuclear plant. And from there, they would engage in raids on Tatar lands, on Turkish lands, and sometimes on the Polish noblemen. Here you can see in this remarkable piece of art by Ilya Repin, something that really speaks to, the Ukrainian national identity, the idea, and this is something I think really fits very well with the way Americans see themselves. As a Canadian looking from the outside in, I perceive this about your wonderful culture, and thank God I'm very happy to be here. But there are some quirks about your culture that I don't quite get. One of those things is like this incredible attachment to freedom, and don't tread on me, and you're not the boss of me. That's definitely a very Ukrainian attitude as well, which comes from the idea of these freebooting Kossake. The leader of these bands was Bogdan Khmelnytsky, shown here on a banknote from modern Ukraine. And he led this major attack against the Poles, against Ukrainians who had converted to Catholicism, who he viewed as traitors, and of course against their middlemen, the Jews. Some of the worst pogroms in Jewish history occurred in the middle of the 17th century, led by this man. So Ukrainians view him as a great national liberator who, brought freedom and independence to the Ukrainians, whereas Jews view him as an incredible anti-Semite. Both of those images are true. They are not yet reconciled in modern Ukraine, but it is in many ways akin to the American difficulty kind of working through a lot of the issues of the Confederate South that continues to the present day. But to give you another example of this Cossack spirit, this is a recent stamp that was inspired by the incident at Snake Island in the war. In the background, you can see the Moskva while it was still floating, and the Ukrainian soldier on Snake Island literally giving the middle finger to Putin, and it goes along with an expletive in Ukrainian as well. That's very much kind of the Cossack spirit, which I think Americans can actually identify with in many ways. So during this entire, what shifted after Khmelnytsky is that although he was a great rebel leader and was able to motivate the Kozaké to organize them and to bring them to bear as a tremendous weapon against the Poles and drive Poles out of much of Ukraine, he was a terrible governor. And once he had control, he didn't know what to do with it. So ultimately, he decided to make a union with Russia in 1654. The guy on the left is actually my younger self when I was doing my dissertation research over there in the 1990s. And behind me is the Great Soviet Monument commemorating that union, which of course is really great for Soviet and Russian propaganda because it indicates the huge friendship of the Ukrainian and Russian peoples, which you can see on the right in the statue, which is actually at the very bottom of the apex of that arch, that shows, heroic, buff, shirtless, strangely, Ukrainian and Russian people upholding the Soviet emblem as a symbol of eternal friendship of Ukrainians and Russians. Here you can see how the arch was defaced by protesters in 2020. They painted a crack on it to indicate that loving relationship between Ukrainians and Russians had changed dramatically in recent years. Now, at this point, I'm seeing that I'm taking a little longer than I expected, so I'm going to kind of zip through this in one sentence. During all of this period, we've had a series of triangular relationships. There's Jews, Ukrainians, and one other people, either the Poles or the Russians. This also repeats itself in the western region of Ukraine, which for most of this part was kind of like an exception because it was under the Austro-Hungarian government rather than the Polish or the Russian government. And in all of those relationships, Jews tended to orient themselves towards the more powerful nationality, originally the Poles and later the Russians. But in the 19th century, that began to see some changes, which we can discuss very briefly now. Well, let's zip ahead to the 20th century. So as I mentioned, during the revolutionary period after the Romanov dynasty fell, there was this brief period of a rapprochement between Jews and Ukrainians that ended in terrible and bloody failure. Central to that failure is the figure shown here in this statue, who is exactly like Khmelnytsky. There are many figures that follow the same kind of path, that it seems that the path to Ukrainian independence is almost invariably wrapped up with anti-Semitic agitation at the same time. Simon Petliura, shown here, is a very misunderstood figure. He was a journalist who found himself at the helm of this fledgling government. And in my research, what I argue is that he was not so much the architect of the violence as he was paralyzed by it and did not know how to control it and did not take the appropriate steps that the leader had in order to control that violence. Nevertheless, Ukrainians view him as a hero. Here you see the statue with the blue and yellow flowers, and the Times of Israel is complaining, of course, that he's, this pogromist, and nevertheless there's a statue set up to him. He was later assassinated in Paris in 1926 by this man, Shalom Schwarzbard, who murdered him specifically because he viewed him as the person who had organized these horrible pogroms in 1919. And when Schwarzbard was amazingly acquitted by a Paris jury, perhaps feeling guilty about the Dreyfus affair that was 30 years earlier, in which they convicted an innocent Jew, in this case they actually acquitted a clearly guilty Jew who murdered him in cold blood in the street and was not repentant about it. But it was nevertheless seen by Jews as a huge victory. Here you can see a remarkable piece by Chagall that shows the raised Torah scroll with the angel of vengeance flying overhead and the word Schwarzbard written in Yiddish, as if that is the Torah. The Torah is Schwarzbard's vengeance. You can imagine the mood of Jews after the pogroms of 1919. And there are many places, like here in Beersheba, where you have a street named after Schwarzbard, which is called Hanokem, the Avenger. So just like we saw with Khmelnytsky, you have a moment in Ukrainian history where the drive towards Ukrainian independence is intimately wrapped up with anti-Semitic activity. The worst period, of course, would be during the Holocaust, and this is what stands and looms so large in the American Jewish diaspora memory. We should understand that Ukraine was divided by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the secret pact between Hitler and Stalin in 1939. You can see here, this region was divided between the Soviets. It was taken over from Poland, divided between the Soviets and the Nazis. And so for 2 years, the Soviets came in and tried to forcibly communize the region, imposing communal agricultural and communal standards and persecuting religion, much like they had in eastern Ukraine, which included the horrible, disastrous Holodomor, the terror famine of 1932-33. At its helm was a Jewish figure named Kaganovich. So many Ukrainians viewed this rapid communization of the era to be essentially an expression of Jewish activity. This was not at all the case. There were some prominent Jews definitely in the Soviet movement, but they were largely purged in the 1920s and early 30s, and you don't have the same kind of phenomenon. But nevertheless, belief is far more important than reality, and many Ukrainians viewed the Jews as being allied with the Soviets that they hated so bitterly. When the Nazis double-crossed the Soviets and invaded, they came into this region with 4 units known as Einsatzgruppen, or mobile killing squads, and this was the so-called Holocaust by bullets. I've already mentioned Babin Yar. That was where some 33,000 Jews lost their lives. And by the way, the Nazis would continue to use that ravine in Kiev for another couple of years, killing another 60,000 non-Jews also in Babi Yar, buried together with the Jews in a massive mass grave. But this is the way in which most Ukrainians were associated, if they were associated with the Nazis and the Holocaust, it was through this Holocaust by bullets, in which the Nazis would employ so-called Hilfswillige, or willing helpers from the local populations who would engage in assisting these mobile killing squads, killing somewhere between 1.5 to 2.5 million people in Eastern Europe. This is incidentally the way in which my own grandparents lost their families at this time. Babi Yar was recently bombed by Putin, of course. Luckily, the monument itself was not damaged. Other features were damaged. But even here you can see, despite the history that I've given you, there's still blue and yellow flowers at this uniquely Jewish Holocaust memorial. So we have to try and unpack these things and try to understand how they fit together. In our current moment, Vladimir Putin is looking to channel his Tsarist predecessors to develop this idea of the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, in which he wants to try and recreate this larger Russia, which includes Ukraine, as an intrinsic component part of it. But it's interesting to note that his his main sort of justification for propaganda purposes for attacking Ukraine is that it is filled with Nazis. But we should understand that, what does that term Nazi mean? I mean, it's clearly absurd. The country is not filled with Nazis. But for Russians, they view the idea of Nazis as anyone who tries to conquer their country from the West. This is a huge thing for them. It's much bigger for Russians than it is even for Americans. As much as we revere the Greatest Generation and D-Day and things like that, Russians, of course, had Nazis on their soil, and so they created, like in Kiev, this massive and rather grotesque, motherland statue to symbolize the defense of the country from those invading Nazis. And so, in a way, Putin is actually thinking of the EU and NATO as the Nazis, and the Ukrainians, by leaning that way, fall into that definition. For Ukrainians during the Nazi period, it's much more interesting, much more relevant to think of their at one time connection to the Nazis, and I'm generalizing because I'm running out of time, as really one in which they're trying to get rid of the Soviets. They view the Nazis as hated enemies, but possible temporary allies. This is actually a propaganda picture from an organization called the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and a related organization called UPA. And as you can see, the soldier here on the bottom, he's trampling on both the Soviet and the Nazi flags, the Soviet one on top, the Nazi one below, because they view the Nazis as their allies to kick out the Soviets. This is still present to some degree in certain elements of Ukrainian society, but as we shall see, fairly small elements. This is the Azov battalion that clearly has a small element. Some scholars estimate as much as 10 to 15% of their enrollees have neo-Nazi inclinations. And in the question and answer, maybe we'll have an opportunity to discuss this in greater detail. Contrast this, on the other hand, by someone like Volodymyr Zelensky, who, like Putin, is named after Prince Vladimir, that very first Ukrainian prince who chose Christianity in 988. But his vision is of a Eurotropic Ukraine. He is not thinking of this Ruski Mir, this great Russian world that includes Ukrainians as younger brothers to the Russians. He's thinking of Ukraine as a multi-ethnic, multinational, modern state that can admit many different populations. And it's amazing that Ukrainians agreed. 72% of them voted for Zelensky in the last presidential election, a phenomenal number that, in America, we can only imagine in a presidential election that has such a high margin of victory. And ironically, Putin's invasion has only accelerated this tendency among Ukrainians. So let me take us now to the implications of the future by way of conclusion. Here's a remarkable study that appeared in 2018 from the Pew Research Center. When asked the question, would you be willing to accept Jews as citizens of your country? Ukrainians were the most welcoming of Jews of all Eastern European countries. Only 5% of Ukrainians said that they would not be willing to admit Jews as citizens of their countries, which, was half as much, a third as much as Russia and Belarus and Poland, a quarter as much as my homeland, Lithuania, and just 1/6 of Armenia. But this is a remarkable number that indicates that even though American Jews tend to have this image of this inveterate Ukrainian anti-Semite, they'll say the Ukrainians were the worst during the Holocaust, which is maybe something we'll discuss in the question and answer period as well. Nevertheless, modern Ukrainians seem not to fit that. And if we compare this number with a similar study done by the same institution in 2019, it's not exactly the same questions, but Jews are very well welcomed in this country. And if you look at the figure on the right, among those who are coolest to Jews, the mean number was 8%. So America may not even be as welcoming to Jews as Ukraine is, which, it kind of boggles the imagination in some ways. Nevertheless, we are looking at an embattled Ukraine at this moment. This map was actually from last week, and I'm not sure what it looks like today. But as Jews, we should recall that, we just read the day before yesterday in synagogue, we just read the Shirat Hayam, the tremendous description of the Jews' escape through the sea when all seemed to be lost. It is arguably the greatest refugee story in world history, and perhaps we should bear this in mind when we're thinking about the fate of Ukrainians who are now also with their backs to the sea and deeply in need of our prayers. I thank you very much for your attention and your endurance, and at this point I'd like to turn it back over to the Rabbi for questions and answers.